For 14 years, Violet Harper believed her sister. She believed there was no inheritance, no family savings, nothing left behind after their parents died. Then, one phone call led her to a forgotten mountain cabin deep in Montana. Hidden inside were old letters, a lost inheritance, and a family secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her life. But the most painful discovery wasn't the money. It was learning who had kept the truth from her all those years. Stay until the end, because this emotional story of betrayal, forgiveness, and hidden truth proves that sometimes the people we trust most hold the secrets that change our lives forever. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in quietly, year after year, loss after loss, until one day you wake up and realize you've been carrying it for so long that it feels like part of your skin. Violet Harper knew that kind of loneliness better than most. She was 24 years old when her world fell apart for the second time. The first time had happened when she was 10. A rainy highway. A truck driver who never saw the red light. One phone call in the middle of the night. And suddenly, both of her parents were gone. Just like that. No goodbyes. No last conversations. No chance to tell them she loved them one more time. The only family she had left was her older sister, Rebecca. Rebecca was 19 at the time. Still young herself, still trying to figure out life, yet somehow she stepped into the role of parent overnight. At least, that's what Violet believed for most of her life. Growing up, she heard the same story over and over again. The accident had taken everything. The house, the savings, the future their parents had planned. There was nothing left. Nothing except each other. So Violet never complained, never asked questions, never wondered why some dreams seemed forever out of reach. When college became too expensive, she accepted it. When she worked double shifts at a diner while friends attended university, she accepted that too. Life was hard. That was simply the truth. Or so she thought. By 24, Violet lived alone in a tiny apartment on the south side of Chicago. The wallpaper peeled near the windows. The radiator made strange noises every winter. And every month felt like a race against bills she was barely keeping ahead of. Still, she carried herself with kindness. The kind of kindness that often grows inside people who have known heartbreak. She smiled at strangers, helped elderly customers carry groceries to their cars, remembered birthdays nobody expected her to remember. The truth was, Violet spent her entire life trying to become the kind of person her parents would have been proud of, even though she barely remembered their faces. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. The phone rang while she was stacking canned goods during a shift at the grocery store. An unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it. Almost. But something made her answer. And within the next 60 seconds, a stranger would tell her something that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her family, everything she believed about her past, and everything Rebecca had spent 14 years trying to keep hidden. At that moment, Violet didn't know it yet, but far away, deep in the mountains of Montana, an old cabin had been waiting for her, waiting through snowstorms, waiting through seasons, waiting through years of silence, waiting for the day the truth finally found its way home. The call lasted less than 3 minutes, but years later, Violet would still remember every word, not because of what was said, because of what it changed. She stood frozen in the stockroom of the grocery store, one hand gripping a half-open box of canned soup, while the voice on the other end calmly introduced himself. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an attorney calling from Bozeman, Montana." Montana. The word meant nothing to her. At first, "I'm sorry," Violet said. "I think you have the wrong person." "No, Miss Harper, I assure you I don't." There was a brief pause, the kind that makes your stomach tighten for reasons you can't explain. "I'm contacting you regarding the estate of your grandfather, Walter Harper." Violet blinked. Her grandfather. She hadn't heard that name in years. Not since she was a child. Not since before the accident. Not since before her entire life split into a before and an after. The lawyer continued. "Mr. Harper passed away 6 weeks ago. According to his will, he left you ownership of a property located outside Livingston, Montana." Violet frowned. "What kind of property?" "A cabin." Silence. She actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded ridiculous. A cabin. She could barely afford rent. The idea that she suddenly owned anything felt absurd. There must be some mistake. There isn't. The attorney's voice remained patient. "Your grandfather updated his will 3 years ago. The property is legally yours." Violet leaned against a shelf. The room suddenly felt warmer. Smaller, more difficult to breathe in. She hadn't spoken to her grandfather in over a decade. Truthfully, she wasn't even sure he was alive. Whenever she asked about him growing up, Rebecca would shut the conversation down almost immediately. "He doesn't want anything to do with us." That was always the answer. Simple, final, painful. Eventually, Violet stopped asking. Children learn quickly which questions hurt too much. "Why me?" she finally asked. Another pause. Then the attorney said something strange. "Mr. Harper was very specific." Violet swallowed. "What do you mean?" "He instructed us to contact you personally and only after his death." A chill crept through her. The stockroom suddenly seemed very far away. The lawyer continued. "There are also several documents he requested be delivered directly into your possession." "What kind of documents?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss that over the phone." Something shifted inside her. Tiny, almost invisible. But there, curiosity. For the first time in years, something about her own family didn't feel finished. The lawyer explained the process. Ownership transfer, paperwork, travel arrangements, most of it blurred together. Her mind was stuck on one question. Why hadn't Rebecca ever told her? That question followed her all afternoon. It followed her through the end of her shift, through the train ride home, through the cheap microwave dinner she barely touched, and later that night, it followed her into the small apartment where she sat staring at the ceiling long after midnight. Sleep never came. Instead, memories did. Small ones, forgotten ones. A deep voice lifting her onto broad shoulders. The smell of pine trees. A rough hand placing a carved wooden horse into hers. A cabin. Not clearly. Just flashes. Pieces. Like old photographs damaged by time. The next morning, Violet called Rebecca. Her sister answered on the third ring. "Hey." The familiar voice should have comforted her. Instead, it made her nervous. "Rebecca," Violet said carefully. "I got a phone call yesterday." A pause. What kind of phone call? The hesitation was subtle, but Violet noticed it. A lawyer. Silence. Longer this time. Too long. The hairs on the back of Violet's neck stood up. "He said Grandpa died." Nothing. Not a single word. Just breathing. Then finally, "Oh." Violet frowned. That was it. "Oh, you knew." Rebecca exhaled slowly. "Violet, you knew." The question came out sharper this time. Another pause. And suddenly the conversation felt different. like stepping into a room and realizing someone had been hiding there the whole time. "How long?" Violet asked quietly. Rebecca didn't answer. That answer was answer enough. Something heavy settled into Violet's chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something worse. Doubt? The conversation ended awkwardly. Too quickly. Rebecca claimed she had to go. Promised they would talk later. But as the call disconnected, Violet sat staring at her phone. A feeling she couldn't explain had taken root. For 14 years, she had trusted her sister completely. Trusted her version of events. Had trusted every explanation. Every story. Every reason. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she should have. 3 days later, Violet boarded a flight to Montana. The ticket had cost more than she could comfortably afford. But something deep inside told her she needed to go. Needed to see the cabin. Needed to understand why a man she barely remembered had waited until after his death to reach her. The plane landed just after noon. By sunset, she was driving north on a narrow road that wound through endless valleys and towering mountains. The landscape felt impossibly large, ancient, quiet. The farther she drove, the smaller the rest of her life seemed. The bills, the apartment, the exhaustion, all of it fading behind her mile by mile. Then finally, the GPS signal disappeared. The road turned to gravel, and there it was. A weathered cabin sitting alone beneath a canopy of pine trees. Waiting, just as it had waited through countless winters. Waiting through storms. Waiting through years of silence. Waiting for her. Violet stepped out of the car. Cold mountain air filled her lungs. The sun hung low behind distant peaks, painting the sky gold and amber. For a long moment, she simply stood there, looking, listening, feeling something she couldn't yet name. The cabin looked old, lonely, forgotten, and yet there was something else, something almost impossible to explain. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt preserved, as if someone had spent years protecting it, preparing it, leaving it untouched for a reason. For her, Violet slowly climbed the wooden steps toward the front porch. The boards creaked beneath her boots. A breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. Then silence returned. She rested her hand on the weathered railing, and for reasons she couldn't understand, tears suddenly filled her eyes. Not because she was sad. Not because she was afraid, because for the first time since losing her parents, she felt close to them, close to something she thought was gone forever, and standing there in the fading light. Violet had no idea that the cabin was holding far more than memories. Hidden inside those walls was a truth powerful enough to rewrite her entire life. That first night, Violet didn't unpack much. There wasn't much to unpack anyway. A small suitcase, a backpack, a worn jacket she had owned since college, and questions. Far too many questions. The cabin was colder than she expected. Not freezing. Just the kind of cold that seeps into old wood and settles there for decades. The kind that makes a place feel forgotten. She found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer and spent the next hour moving from room to room. The cabin wasn't large. A living room. A small kitchen. A narrow hallway. 2 bedrooms. Everything looked untouched. Not abandoned. Preserved. As though someone had quietly maintained the place long after everyone else stopped visiting. That thought lingered with her. Because if her grandfather had truly wanted nothing to do with the family, why had he kept this place alive? Outside, darkness swallowed the mountains. Inside, the silence felt almost sacred. Violet eventually settled into an old armchair beside the stone fireplace. The flames crackled softly. Shadows danced across the walls. And for the first time in years, she wasn't distracted by noise. No traffic, no television, no endless notifications. Just silence and memory. She found herself thinking about her parents. Not the accident. Not the funeral. The little things. Her mother's laugh. Her father's habit of singing terribly in the car. The way they used to hold hands when they thought nobody was watching. Memories she'd spent years trying not to lose. A sharp crack from the fireplace startled her. She looked up, then froze. Something had fallen. A small object lay on the floor near the hearth. Violet frowned. She walked closer. It was a photograph. Old, faded, yellow around the edges. She picked it up carefully. The moment she saw it, her breath caught. It was her, at least, a much younger version of her, maybe 8 years old, standing beside her parents and her grandfather, all four of them smiling, happy, together. Violet stared at the image. She had never seen this photograph before. Never. Not once. Yet here it was, hidden behind the fireplace mantel, almost as if it had slipped loose from somewhere inside the wall. She stepped closer. The mantel itself looked unusual. One corner sat slightly uneven. Not enough to notice at first glance, but now she couldn't ignore it. Carefully, she ran her fingers along the wood. Then she felt it. A narrow gap. Tiny. Almost invisible. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed the flashlight. The beam revealed something tucked deep behind the mantel. Paper. Old paper. Violet's heart began to pound. Slowly. She reached inside. Her fingers brushed against a bundle wrapped in cloth. She pulled. The package slid free. Dust drifted through the air. For a long moment, she simply stared. The bundle had been deliberately hidden. Not lost. Not forgotten. Hidden. The cloth was tied with faded string. Hands trembling slightly, Violet untied the knot. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Carefully stacked. Each one addressed in the same handwriting. To Violet. Her breath stopped. To Violet. Not to Rebecca. Not to the family. To Violet. The room suddenly felt very small. She picked up the first envelope. The handwriting looked familiar somehow. Not because she recognized it. Because something deep inside her wanted to. The postmark was 16 years old. 16. Her hands began to shake. Slowly, she opened it. The paper crackled softly. Then she started reading. My dearest Violet, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. The words blurred instantly. She blinked hard. Read them again. My dearest Violet. A strange pressure built in her chest. The kind that comes before tears. The letter continued. I don't know if this will ever reach you. I pray it does. Your mother and father loved you more than words can explain. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. Violet lowered the paper. Her entire body had gone still. Nobody had ever written to her like that. Nobody. She swallowed and continued reading. There are things you deserve to know one day. Things I promised your father I would protect until the time was right. Your inheritance. Your family's land. And the plans your parents made for your future. The words hit her like cold water. Inheritance. Land. Future. Her eyes raced back across the page. No, that couldn't be right. Rebecca had always said there was nothing left. Nothing. The accident took everything. That was the story. The only story. Yet here, in black ink faded by time, was something completely different. Violet grabbed another letter, then another, and another. The story repeated itself, again and again. References to trust funds, property, savings accounts, legal documents, family assets, things that shouldn't have existed, things Rebecca had sworn never existed. Her breathing became shallow. The fire crackled behind her, but she barely heard it. Then she found the letter that changed everything. It was shorter than the others, only one page. At the bottom sat a date. 3 months after her parents' deaths. Violet unfolded it carefully. The handwriting seemed rushed, uneven, almost desperate. If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I failed. I tried to protect what your parents left for you. But Rebecca has taken control of everything. I fear she is making decisions she cannot undo. I fear greed is beginning to speak louder than grief. For a moment, Violet couldn't breathe. She read the sentence again, and again, and again. Rebecca has taken control of everything. The room spun. Her sister, the woman who raised her, the woman she trusted, the woman she loved. No, it couldn't be. Could it? Violet dropped the letter into her lap. Outside, wind brushed against the cabin walls. Inside, silence settled heavily around her. Suddenly, dozens of moments from her childhood resurfaced. Questions that were never answered. Conversations cut short. Letters she was told never arrived. Phone calls she was never allowed to return. Her grandfather's name becoming forbidden. Little things, tiny things, things that had never made sense before. Now they did. And the realization hurt far more than she expected. Because the greatest shock wasn't discovering a hidden inheritance. It wasn't learning about the cabin, or the money, or the land. It was realizing that the person she trusted most in the world might have been lying to her for 14 years. A tear rolled down her cheek. Then another, not because of what she'd lost, because of what she'd believed. There's a special kind of heartbreak that comes when the truth finally arrives. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough for you to hear every piece of your old life breaking apart. Violet sat there long after midnight. The letters spread across the coffee table, the fire burning lower with every passing hour. And somewhere deep inside her, a new feeling was beginning to emerge. Not anger, not yet, something stronger. Determination. Because if these letters were real, then somewhere out there was the rest of the story. And for the first time in her life, Violet intended to find it. The next morning, Violet woke up in the armchair. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The gray light filtering through the cabin windows felt unfamiliar. The silence felt unfamiliar. Then she saw the letters scattered across the coffee table, and everything came rushing back. The hidden bundle, her grandfather's handwriting, the words she had read over and over until nearly 3 in the morning. Rebecca has taken control of everything. Violet closed her eyes. Part of her wished she had imagined it. That exhaustion had somehow distorted the words. But the letters were still there, waiting, faucient, unchanged. The truth often does that. It waits, whether we're ready for it or not. She rose slowly and walked to the kitchen. The old floorboards creaked beneath her feet. Outside, morning sunlight spilled across the mountains. The world looked peaceful, almost unfairly peaceful, because inside her, nothing felt peaceful at all. She made coffee and carried the mug onto the porch. The air was cold enough to sting her cheeks. Pine trees stretched across the valley below. A thin layer of mist drifted through the hills like smoke. Violet sat down on the wooden steps, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about her parents honestly. Not through Rebecca's version, not through grief, not through childhood memories blurred by time, but through the letters, through their words, their plans, their hopes, the people they actually were. One letter in particular had stayed with her all night. She unfolded it again. The paper was fragile now, its edges worn from age. My sweet girl, if you're reading this one day, I hope you've learned something your mother and I spent our lives trying to teach. Your worth is not measured by what you own. It's measured by how you treat people when nobody is watching. Violet smiled sadly. That sounded exactly like her father. She remembered fragments now, little moments she hadn't thought about in years. The way he stopped to help strangers on the side of the road. The way he tipped waitresses even when money was tight. The way he always seemed to believe there would be enough. Enough time. Enough kindness. Enough love. For years, Violet had worried she was failing at life. She hadn't finished college. She struggled financially. She lived paycheck to paycheck. Sometimes she barely kept her head above water. Yet as she sat there reading her father's words, a question appeared. Who told her that struggle meant failure? The answer arrived almost immediately. Nobody had said it directly, but she had spent years comparing herself to everyone around her, watching classmates succeed, buy homes, build careers, start families. Meanwhile, she worked long shifts and counted dollars before buying groceries. Somewhere along the way, she had begun believing that surviving wasn't enough, that if life remained difficult, she must be doing something wrong. But her parents' letters told a different story. Again and again, they described resilience, character, compassion, the things they hoped she would become, not the things they hoped she would own. The distinction hit her harder than she expected, because she realized something painful. She had spent 14 years mourning things that were never actually lost. The future, opportunity, possibility. Rebecca had convinced her there was nothing left. No inheritance, no family legacy, no foundation. So Violet built her entire identity around scarcity, around limitation, around making herself smaller, safer, less hopeful, less disappointed. A breeze moved through the trees. The mountains stood silent before her, ancient, steady, unconcerned by human mistakes. For the first time, Violet understood why her grandfather had stayed here. The mountains didn't care about appearances. They didn't care about status. They simply remained. Storm after storm, winter after winter, and somehow that thought comforted her. Back inside the cabin, she continued reading. Hour after hour, letter after letter. The picture became clearer. Her parents hadn't been wealthy, but they had been careful, responsible. They had built savings, purchased land, created investments intended to help Violet later in life. Not enough to make her rich, but enough to give her options, enough to give her freedom, and perhaps the hardest realization of all, enough that she never should have struggled the way she did. Violet sat at the kitchen table staring at the documents. A strange mix of emotions swirled inside her. Sadness, relief, anger, gratitude, all at once. But beneath all of them was something new, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Clarity. For years, she believed her life was the result of bad luck, of circumstances, of unfortunate timing. Now she saw another possibility. Maybe she had been making decisions based on incomplete information. Maybe she had been navigating life while someone else held part of the map. The thought should have made her furious. Oddly, it didn't. Not yet. Because something more important was happening. For the first time, Violet wasn't looking backward. She was looking forward. What if the story she believed about herself wasn't true? What if she wasn't the girl who had been abandoned by opportunity? What if she was the woman her parents believed she could become? The woman described in these letters: strong, capable, kind, resilient, not despite hardship, 'cause of it. She thought about all the years she'd spent helping others, working extra shifts, supporting friends through breakups, showing up when people needed her. Nobody had forced her to become that person. She had chosen it, again and again, and suddenly she felt proud of herself. Not in a loud way, not in an arrogant way, in a quiet way, the way a person feels when they finally stop apologizing for surviving. Late that afternoon, Violet climbed a small ridge behind the cabin. The hike wasn't difficult, but the view at the top stole her breath. Miles of mountains stretched toward the horizon, layer after layer disappearing into the distance. She stood there for a long time, the wind tugging gently at her hair, the letters tucked safely inside her jacket. For years, she'd looked at her life through the lens of loss, orphaned, struggling, forgotten. But standing there now, she began seeing something else. She had endured. She had adapted. She had built a life from almost nothing. And maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't about what had been taken from her. Maybe it was about what remained. The strength her parents left behind. The values they planted inside her. The love that somehow survived 14 years of silence. As the sun dipped lower across the mountains, Violet looked toward the cabin below. It no longer felt like a place filled with secrets. It felt like a place filled with answers. And somewhere deep inside her, a decision was beginning to form. She wasn't here merely to uncover the past. She was here to reclaim her future. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, she believed that future might be far brighter than she had ever imagined. Opportunities don't always arrive looking like opportunities. Sometimes they arrive looking like old paperwork, dust-covered boxes, forgotten records, things most people would throw away without a second glance. 3 days after discovering the letters, Violet found herself standing in the cabin's attic. The space smelled of cedar and age. Sunlight slipped through narrow gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating floating specks of dust that danced lazily in the air. She almost hadn't come up here. The attic looked untouched for decades. Old furniture sat beneath white sheets. Broken fishing rods leaned against a corner. A rusted trunk rested beneath the far window. Nothing about it seemed remarkable, until she noticed the label. Harper Family Records. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, she knelt beside the trunk. The brass latch resisted at first, then finally gave way with a sharp metallic click. Inside were dozens of folders, neatly organized, carefully dated, as though someone had expected them to be found. Expected her to find them. Violet pulled out the first folder. Tax records. Property documents, insurance papers, nothing unusual, at least not at first. Then she found the signatures, her father's, her mother's, and beneath them, numbers, assets, investments, land ownership. Violet's eyes widened. She grabbed another folder, then another. The same story repeated itself, again and again. Her parents hadn't been wealthy, but they had built something. A foundation. A future. The very thing Rebecca had always claimed never existed. for hours. Violet sat cross-legged on the attic floor, reading document after document. The deeper she dug, the more impossible the truth became. There had been savings accounts, college funds, investment portfolios, life insurance policies. Not enough to create luxury, but more than enough to create stability. The word echoed through her mind. Stability. The thing she had spent most of her adult life chasing. The thing she thought had disappeared the night her parents died. But it hadn't disappeared. It had been there all along. Somewhere around noon, she found a sealed envelope tucked inside a ledger book. Unlike the others, this one had her name written across the front. The handwriting belonged to her grandfather. Violet opened it carefully. Inside was a single note. If you've reached this point, you've discovered enough to know that the story you've been told isn't the whole story. There are additional records held at First Valley Trust in Livingston. The key is hidden beneath the false bottom of my desk. Trust the documents. Trust the numbers. Truth leaves a trail. Violet stared at the words. Truth leaves a trail. Her grandfather seemed to understand something most people didn't. People can lie. Memories can change. But records remember everything. Her heart pounded. She immediately went downstairs. The old desk sat in the corner of the living room. For years, it had probably looked completely ordinary. Now she saw it differently. Within minutes, she found the hidden compartment. Inside lay a small brass key and a safety deposit box number. Violet sat back in stunned silence. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was preparation. Someone had spent years making sure the truth would survive. Even if they didn't. The next morning, she drove into Livingston. The bank occupied a modest brick building near the center of town. Nothing about it looked extraordinary. Yet, as she approached the entrance, her hands trembled. Because deep down, she knew. Whatever waited inside was important. A bank manager named Margaret greeted her. She looked to be in her 70s. Kind eyes. A silver hair. The sort of person who reminded Violet of schoolteachers and grandmothers. When Violet presented the paperwork, Margaret's expression softened. You're Walter's granddaughter. It wasn't a question. Violet nodded. The older woman smiled sadly. He talked about you often. Violet's throat tightened. The simple sentence hit harder than expected, because for most of her life, she'd believed she had been forgotten. Apparently she hadn't. Margaret led her into the vault. The heavy steel door closed behind them. The sound echoed through the room. A moment later, a small metal box rested on the table between them. Violet inserted the key, turned it, and opened the lid. Inside were 3 things: a flash drive, a thick folder, and a cashier's check. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she looked closer. The amount printed on the check made her stop breathing. Not millions, nothing extravagant, but enough to change everything. Enough to pay off debts. Enough to finish school if she wanted. Enough to stop living one emergency away from disaster. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Not because of the money itself, because of what it represented. Relief. For the first time in years. Relief. She wiped her eyes and opened the folder. The first pages contained copies of account statements, trust records, property transactions, legal filings. Everything was meticulously organized. Her grandfather had highlighted specific sections, added handwritten notes in the margins. Question this transfer. Look at the date. Compare signatures. Violet's pulse quickened. The farther she read, the clearer the pattern became. Money had moved. Assets had disappeared. Property had changed hands. and nearly every trail led back to one person. Rebecca. Violet sat motionless. A part of her still wanted another explanation, another answer, a misunderstanding. But facts have a way of narrowing possibilities. The evidence didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It simply existed. Quiet, undeniable. Truth leaves a trail. Her grandfather had been right. Finally, she picked up the flash drive. A nearby office computer was available for customer use. Margaret helped her access the files. There were scanned documents, photographs, letters, video recordings, years' worth of information. At the very bottom sat a file labeled, "For Violet." Her hands trembled as she clicked it. The screen flickered. Then an elderly man appeared. Her grandfather. Older than she remembered, thinner, but unmistakably him. For a moment he simply looked into the camera, as though he were looking directly at her. Then he smiled. "Hello, sweetheart." Violet immediately covered her mouth. The years vanished. She was 10 years old again. A little girl who had lost almost everyone she loved. "I don't know when you'll see this," he began softly. "But if you are watching, it means you've finally found your way here." His voice cracked slightly. "I wish I could have told you everything myself." Violet felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I tried to protect what your parents built for you." He paused, looking down briefly, then back at the camera. "And if you're seeing this now, I need you to understand something." His eyes softened. "None of what happened was your fault." The words hit her like sunlight breaking through years of storm clouds. None of what happened was your fault. For years she had quietly blamed herself for things she never understood. For opportunities lost. For dreams abandoned. For a life that always felt harder than it should have been. And now, for the first time, someone was telling her otherwise. Someone who knew the whole story. Someone who loved her. As the video continued, Violet realized something profound. The inheritance wasn't the greatest gift waiting inside that safety deposit box. The greatest gift was something else entirely. The chance to stop seeing herself as a victim of the past and start seeing herself as the author of what came next. Growth rarely feels like growth while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels like discomfort, like uncertainty, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing there's no way back to the person you used to be. For Violet Harper, that realization arrived 3 days after she returned from the bank. The morning began quietly. A cup of coffee, a stack of documents spread across the kitchen table, sunlight filtering through the cabin windows. For the first time in weeks, her thoughts felt organized. Not settled, but organized. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. The letters, the bank records, the hidden assets, the video from her grandfather, and beneath it all, a painful truth she could no longer ignore. Rebecca had lied. Not once, not twice, for years. Violet hated the thought, because it forced her to question memories she had spent her entire life protecting. She remembered scraped knees, birthday cakes, late-night talks when she was scared after their parents died. Rebecca had been there for all of it. How could someone be both things? The sister who raised her, and the woman who betrayed her? The question followed her everywhere. It followed her into the woods behind the cabin. It followed her down mountain trails. It followed her into her dreams. And no matter how many times she asked it, the answer never came, because people are rarely one thing. They're often many things at once, capable of love, capable of selfishness, capable of sacrifice, capable of betrayal, sometimes all in the same heart. Late that afternoon, Violet's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Rebecca. For a moment, she simply stared. The old version of herself would have ignored the call, avoided the confrontation, pretended she wasn't ready. But something had changed. Slowly, she answered. Hello. Silence. Then her sister's voice. You found the cabin? It wasn't a question. Violet looked out the window toward the mountains. Yes. Another pause. I figured you would. Rebecca sounded tired, older somehow. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. 14 years of history sat between them. Heavy, complicated. Finally, Violet asked the question she had been carrying for days. Wait, the word hung in the air. Simple, small, devastating. On the other end of the line, Rebecca exhaled slowly. You think it's that easy to explain? No, Violet replied quietly. I don't. The silence that followed felt endless. Then Rebecca spoke. When Mom and Dad died, I was 19. Violet closed her eyes. She had never heard her sister talk about those days. Not honestly. Not like this. I was terrified. Her voice cracked. I didn't know what I was doing. The confession caught Violet off guard. I had bills, lawyers, debt. A child who suddenly depended on me. A child. For a moment, Violet almost forgot she had once been that child. I told myself I was protecting us. Rebecca continued. I told myself I'd fix everything later. Violet's grip tightened around the phone. But later never came. Neither of them needed to say it. They both knew. How much? Violet asked. The question barely rose above a whisper. Silence. Then finally, enough. The answer landed like a stone. Not because of the money, because of the honesty. At last. For years, Violet imagined this moment. She imagined rage, screaming, accusations, but standing there in the cabin kitchen, she felt something unexpected. Sadness. Just sadness. Because suddenly she could see the entire picture. Not excuses. Not justification. Just reality. A frightened 19-year-old girl had made terrible decisions, then spent 14 years burying them, and the deeper she buried them, the harder they became to uncover. When the call ended, Violet sat quietly for a long time. The mountains outside stood motionless beneath the evening sky, steady, unmoved, just like they had been yesterday, and the day before, and 100 years before that. Something about them comforted her, because they reminded her that storms pass, even the ones we create ourselves. The next week brought more legal conversations, more paperwork, more evidence. Her attorney reviewed the documents and confirmed what she already suspected. There was a strong case, a very strong case, but what surprised him wasn't the evidence. It was Violet. You seem remarkably calm. She smiled softly. A month earlier, she would have agreed. Now she wasn't so sure, because calm wasn't the right word. Grounded was. For years, Violet had been reacting to life, reacting to bills, reacting to problems, reacting to disappointments. Now she was choosing how to respond, choosing what kind of person she wanted to become. And that made all the difference. One afternoon, a storm rolled across the mountains. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. Rain hammered the cabin roof. Wind shook the trees. The old Violet would have curled up inside and waited for it to pass. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, not because she enjoyed storms, because she wasn't afraid of them anymore. The rain soaked her hair almost instantly. Thunder echoed through the valley. Yet she remained there, watching, listening, thinking. For years, she'd believed that strength meant never being hurt, never falling apart, never needing help. But her grandfather's letters had taught her something different. Strength wasn't about avoiding hardship. It was about continuing after hardship. Standing again, trying again, trusting again, even when experience gave you every reason not to. The storm raged for nearly an hour. Then, just as quickly as it arrived, it moved on, leaving behind silence and sunlight. Violet laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because the mountains had given her another lesson. Storms always feel permanent while you're standing inside them, until suddenly, they aren't. That evening, she sat by the fireplace and opened her grandfather's notebook once more. A sentence near the back caught her attention, perhaps because she was finally ready to understand it. Forgiveness and accountability are not enemies. You can offer one while demanding the other. Violet read the words twice, then a third time, and something inside her settled. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't trying to destroy Rebecca. She wasn't even trying to reclaim the past. The past was gone. Nothing could change that. What she wanted was simpler: truth, justice, and the freedom to move forward without carrying someone else's secrets. The fire crackled softly. Outside, stars filled the Montana sky. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Violet realized something remarkable. She no longer felt like the frightened little girl who lost her parents. She no longer felt like the struggling woman barely surviving in Chicago. Somewhere between the letters, the mountains, and the truth, she'd become someone new, someone stronger, someone wiser, someone ready. And deep in her heart, Violet knew the hardest chapter was still ahead. But she also knew something else. For the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid to face it. The courtroom was quieter than Violet expected. Not silent, just heavy. The kind of quiet that settles over a room when everyone understands something important is about to happen. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long rectangles across the polished floor. Violet sat beside her attorney, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Months ago, she would have been terrified. Months ago, she would have felt small, overwhelmed, outmatched. But as she looked around the room now, she felt something different. Peace, not because she knew what would happen, because she knew who she was. Across the courtroom sat Rebecca. For the first time in weeks, Violet allowed herself to really look at her sister, not as the person who had hurt her, not as the keeper of secrets, just as Rebecca, the woman who had been 19 years old when their parents died, the woman who had suddenly found herself raising a grieving child while trying to survive her own grief, the woman who had made choices that changed both their lives forever. Rebecca looked older than Violet remembered, not physically, emotionally, as if the weight she'd been carrying for 14 years had finally become visible. The hearing lasted most of the morning. Financial records were reviewed, property transfers examined, account statements presented. Everything that had been hidden was now sitting in plain view. Facts have a strange power. They don't shout. They don't accuse. They simply exist, and eventually they become impossible to ignore. Throughout the proceedings, Violet barely spoke. She didn't need to. The documents spoke clearly enough. By early afternoon, the judge called for a brief recess. People began leaving the room. Attorneys gathered papers. Clerks organized files. The tension slowly loosened. Violet remained seated, staring out the window, thinking. A soft voice interrupted her. "Violet." She turned. Rebecca stood a few feet away, alone. For a moment, neither woman moved. Neither spoke. 14 years. Countless memories. Too much pain for simple conversation. Then Rebecca slowly sat down in the empty chair beside her. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "I used to rehearse this moment." Violet looked at her. "What moment?" "The one where you found out." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Rebecca stared at her hands. "I imagined 1,000 different versions." A sad smile touched her lips. "In every one of them, you hated me." Violet didn't answer. Because for a while, she had. Not hate exactly, but something close. A wound deep enough to resemble it. Rebecca swallowed. "When Mom and Dad died," her voice broke. For several seconds, she couldn't continue. Violet had never seen her sister like this. Never. "I was terrified." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes. "I know that doesn't excuse anything." She shook her head. "It doesn't." The words hung in the air. Honest. Painful. True. I kept telling myself I would fix it. Rebecca continued. "Every year I told myself the same thing." Her eyes remained fixed on the floor. "Next year," another pause. "Then the year after that," tears slipped down her cheeks. But the longer I waited, the harder it became. Violet felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Understanding. The beginning of it. Rebecca laughed softly through her tears. "You know what the worst part is." Violet said nothing. "I never stopped loving you." The confession landed harder than anything said inside the courtroom all morning. Rebecca wiped at her highs. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." Her voice trembled. "But every decision I made after that first one, every lie, every secret." She looked up, directly into Violet's eyes. "I have regretted them every single day." Silence. Long. Heavy. Real. For the first time, Violet wasn't looking at a villain. She was looking at a broken human being. Someone who had made terrible choices. Someone who had spent 14 years living inside those choices. And suddenly, the anger she'd carried for weeks felt different. Smaller somehow. Not gone. Just no longer in control. The judge returned shortly afterward. Everyone resumed their seats. The final decision took less than 20 minutes. The court ordered the restoration of all remaining assets belonging to Violet. Several disputed property claims were ruled in her favor. Additional proceedings would follow. But the outcome itself was clear. The truth had prevailed. When the hearing ended, people began filing out. The battle was over. At least the legal one. Outside, late afternoon sunlight warmed the courthouse steps. Violet stood alone for a moment, taking a breath, letting everything settle. The victory felt different than she imagined. She thought it would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt quiet, because the greatest thing she gained wasn't money, our property, or even justice. It was freedom. Freedom from uncertainty. Freedom from lies. Freedom from the story she'd been living inside for 14 years. Footsteps approached behind her. Rebecca. Again. Neither woman spoke immediately. Then Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out a small object. A faded photograph. Violet immediately recognized it. The four of them. Her parents. Rebecca and herself, taken long before the accident. Rebecca carefully handed it to her. "I kept this all these years." Violet studied the picture. The edges were worn from being handled countless times. It carried, protected, loved. Rebecca smiled sadly. "There wasn't a single day I forgot what I owed you." Violet felt tears gathering again. This time she didn't fight them. For a moment, neither sister spoke. Then something remarkable happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not perfect. Simply human. Violet stepped forward and hugged her. Rebecca broke instantly. Years of guilt, years of grief, years of shame, all collapsing at once. The two sisters stood there on the courthouse steps, holding on to each other while the past finally loosened its grip. Neither of them would ever get those 14 years back. Some wounds leave scars. That's the truth. But scars are proof of healing, too. Eventually, they stepped apart. Rebecca wiped her eyes and laughed softly. So, what happens now? Violet looked toward the distant mountains visible beyond the town. The mountains where the cabin waited. The mountains that had changed everything. A smile touched her face. For the first time in a very long time, the future didn't feel frightening. It felt open. "I'm going home," she said. And this time, home wasn't a place she'd lost. It was a place she'd finally found. For a long time, Violet thought the inheritance was the greatest thing she would get back. She was wrong. The most valuable thing she recovered wasn't the money. It wasn't the land. It wasn't even the truth. It was herself. Months after the court case ended, Violet made a decision. She kept the cabin, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a symbol of healing. She renovated the old rooms and opened the property to young women who were struggling with loss, loneliness, and uncertainty. Women who, like her, needed a place to start over. What was once a cabin filled with secrets became a place filled with hope. A place where broken hearts could rest. A place where new stories could begin. One evening, a young guest asked her, "Hey, how did you survive everything that happened to you?" Violet smiled and looked toward the mountains. Then she answered softly, "I stopped focusing on what was taken from me and started focusing on what remained." The mountains stood quietly in the distance, just as they always had, steady, unmoving. A reminder that storms may leave scars, but they don't have to define us. Life will disappoint you. People will hurt you. Sometimes the people you trust most. But even then, your story is not over. Because strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up. And sometimes, the hardest chapters of your life become the reason someone else finds hope in theirs. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a reminder that second chances are real. And remember, your past may shape your story, but it does not get to decide how it ends.